I can still feel the sting of that afternoon, the soft hum of Caitlin's expensive kitchen appliances, the scent of cinnamon drifting through the air, and the way her eyes slid over me as if I were an obligation instead of family. The room was glowing with warm holiday light, yet somehow I felt colder than the rain tapping against the window. In that moment, something inside me shifted, quietly, but unmistakably. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because being underestimated like that leaves a mark deeper than most people realize. I didn't say anything then. I just stood there, holding the weight of her judgment like a stone in my chest. I had no idea that moment would change everything. Let me show you how it all began. I still remember the sting of that moment, the way it caught me off guard and settled deep in my chest. One quiet Sunday afternoon, my daughter-in-law looked at me with a kind of patient dismissal, as if I were someone who needed to be managed rather than understood. In just a breath, she made it clear she thought I had nothing left to offer. That was the moment everything in my life began to shift, even if she didn't know it yet. My name is Linda Carson. I'm in my early 60s, and I've spent my whole life tucked away in Portland, Oregon, moving through the world with a quiet determination. I've weathered decades of responsibility, setbacks, and small victories that no one ever really saw. I learned early on that resilience doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers until the day it finally rises. But there was something different about this particular hurt. It wasn't just disrespect. It was the way it echoed every moment I'd been underestimated, overlooked, or told, sometimes gently, sometimes not, that I should stay in my place. As I stood there, listening to her talk as though my life had already passed its usefulness, I felt a steady heat forming in my chest. Not anger, recognition, a reminder of who I used to be and who I had quietly become. What she didn't realize was that life had been preparing me for a moment like this. Something was already moving beneath the surface, something she would never see coming. And that is where the real story begins. Let me take you back to how all of this truly started. When I look back over my life, what stands out the most isn't the hardship itself, but the way each setback shaped me into someone who learned to stand steady even when the ground shook beneath me. I became a single mother earlier than I ever expected. Evan came into my world at a time when money was tight, sleep was rare, and the future felt like something I had to build with my own two hands. I held whatever work I could find, office temp jobs, retail shifts, the kind of roles where you learn to stretch every dollar and swallow your pride more often than you'd like. But through it all, Evan became my anchor. His little face reminded me every day that even small steps counted. As he grew, so did the quiet distance between the life we had and the life he began reaching for. When he married Caitlin, I tried to be happy for him, and in many ways, I genuinely was. Still, I couldn't ignore the shift that settled in. Her world carried a kind of polish that mine never did. Families with lake houses, conversations about vacations I only saw in magazines, expectations that floated above my head like unspoken judgments. No one ever said anything directly, but I could feel the subtle tightening in my chest whenever I walked into their gatherings. I became the woman who tried not to take up too much space, but somewhere in those years, something unexpected sparked inside me. Maybe it was the loneliness of an emptying nest, or the realization that life wasn't finished with me yet. I started paying attention to things I once thought were for other people: money, investing. The simple idea that my future didn't have to shrink just because I was getting older. It began as curiosity, almost accidental at first, but it soon grew into something far more steady and intentional. That curiosity would eventually become the quiet engine behind everything that came next. My curiosity started quietly, almost shyly, like a small light flickering in a corner of my mind. After years of living paycheck to paycheck, the thought of investing felt like reaching into a world meant for people with more money, more confidence, more everything. But I kept thinking about the years I spent working in different offices, watching companies rise and fall, seeing how decisions trickled down to the people at the bottom. Those memories stayed with me, and one evening I finally sat down with a notebook and let myself begin. I started with the basics: free articles, old library books, videos that explain things in plain language. At first, every chart looked like a foreign alphabet. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that whispered I was too late to learn something this complicated. But I kept going. Night after night, I studied after work, letting the confusion slowly give way to understanding. My first investment was tiny. I used money I had cautiously saved, fully expecting I might lose it. I remember the way my hands trembled as I confirmed the trade, as if that small gesture was somehow louder than anything I had done in years. And when it grew, just a little, I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't the gain itself. It was realizing I could learn, adapt, and trust my own judgment. Over time, I noticed patterns. Companies treated their employees the way they treated their finances. I had lived through enough corporate storms to recognize when something looked unstable. That experience became my compass. Every choice I made felt grounded, almost instinctive. Eventually, my research led me to a mid-sized tech company called Harbor Point Systems. On paper, everything looked polished, but the numbers, something felt off, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I couldn't shake the sense that a fracture was forming beneath their shiny exterior. I didn't know it then, but that quiet intuition would collide directly with my personal life, starting with a Thanksgiving I would never forget. Thanksgiving at Evan and Caitlin's house always felt like stepping into a world that wasn't built with someone like me in mind. Their place in Bellevue had that glossy perfection you see in magazines: polished wood, soft lighting, candles that smelled like things I'd never cooked with in my life. The moment I walked in, I felt my shoulders tense, as if I needed to shrink myself just to fit. Caitlin's family moved around the house with an ease I couldn't imitate. They talked about ski trips and remodels and holiday plans at resorts I couldn't even picture. I stood there, nodding politely, trying to ignore the quiet ache that formed when I realized how far my life looked from theirs. There was no malice in their smiles, but there was a distance, one that reminded me I was the outsider they tolerated, not someone who naturally belonged. At one point, I made the mistake of sharing a small piece of my new interest in investing. I thought maybe it would bridge the gap, give me something to contribute. Instead, I felt the room cool. Their expressions softened in that patronizing way people use when they're humoring a child. They offered gentle laughter, the kind that suggests you should leave the grown-up topics to those with bigger bank accounts. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, and I tried to swallow the embarrassment before it reached my eyes. I excused myself under the pretense of checking on something in my purse, grateful for a moment alone. When I picked up my phone, a notification flashed across the screen, an alert about Harbor Point Systems. The numbers were slipping again, sharper this time. Something was unraveling beneath their polished facade. For a moment, the noise of the house faded. I stared at my phone, sensing the weight of a shift I couldn't yet name. Something in my life, just like that company, was reaching a breaking point. And soon, both would collide in ways none of them ever expected. In the days after that Thanksgiving, I carried a quiet heaviness with me. It wasn't just the embarrassment, It was the realization that I had spent too many years letting other people decide what I was capable of. I was still thinking about that feeling when my phone rang one morning. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer. On the other end was a business broker I had spoken to months earlier, back when I was still learning the language of investments. He told me Harbor Point Systems was being prepared for acquisition, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The same company I had been studying, the one flashing warning signs during Thanksgiving, was suddenly within reach. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the documents he sent. The numbers confirmed everything my instincts had whispered: mismanagement, declining morale, leadership that ignored every red flag, and beneath all of that, potential, real potential. I felt a wave of doubt roll through me. Who was I to consider something this enormous? I was a woman who once worried about stretching $20 to last the week. But then another thought came, sharper, steadier. I had spent my whole life solving problems no one else bothered to see. Maybe this wasn't impossible. Maybe it was the moment I had quietly been walking toward for years. I reviewed my accounts. Every investment I had grown piece by piece. Liquidating them felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, but I didn't flinch. Fear was there. Yes, but so was clarity. I submitted the offer, my hands shaking as I pressed the final button, and just like that, the ground shifted beneath my life. I was no longer watching from the outside. I was stepping into the room where everything was about to change. Walking into Harbor Point headquarters for the first time as its new owner felt surreal. The lobby was sleek and cold, all glass and steel, the kind of place designed to make visitors feel small. But that morning, for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. I stood a little straighter as I made my way to the executive conference room, the air humming with that familiar corporate tension I had once only observed from the edges. When the meeting began, the executives moved through their presentations with rehearsed confidence. I listened carefully, taking in every chart, every hesitation, every detail that confirmed just how deeply the company had drifted from its potential. It was strange to sit at the head of the table, watching people who had no idea that the quiet woman beside them now held the authority they once wielded so casually. And then Caitlin walked in. She didn't see me at first. She slid into her seat, flipping open her folder with the ease of someone who believed her place in the room was unquestioned. When her eyes finally landed on me, I felt the shift ripple through her. Confusion first, then a tightening around her mouth, followed by the slow realization that the woman she once dismissed now owned the company she managed. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The truth settled between us with a clarity sharper than anything I could have spoken. As she began presenting the marketing report, I watched her closely, seeing every crack in the department she was responsible for. The numbers told a story she hadn't anticipated sharing with me. By the time the meeting ended, I knew what needed to happen next. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability, and I was ready to take the next step. The day after that meeting, I sat alone in my office with the marketing report spread out in front of me. Numbers don't lie, even when we wish they would. Every chart, every declining metric, every missed benchmark confirmed what I already sensed during Caitlin's presentation. The department hadn't just slipped, it had been neglected. Patterns of poor oversight, inflated projections, and reactive decisions were woven through every document. As I read, I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. This wasn't about her being my daughter-in-law anymore. This was about the health of the company I had just risked everything to save. The emotional conflict came in waves. Part of me wanted to look the other way, to spare Evan from the fallout, to spare myself from the guilt I knew would follow. But another part, steady, calm, and rooted in the woman I'd grown into, knew that leadership demanded clarity, not comfort. I couldn't protect her from the consequences of her own choices, not when so many employees depended on solid leadership. When the moment finally came, I carried myself with the same quiet resolve that had guided me through every difficult season of my life. I explained the decision plainly, without anger or triumph. I watched the realization move through her, not with satisfaction, but with the somber understanding that this was the only fair path forward. It hurt. It hurt more than I expected. After she left, I sat for a long time in the stillness of my office, relief and sadness tangled together inside me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt responsible. But as the quiet settled, I also felt something else: clarity. I had drawn a boundary, not out of spite, but out of necessity. And that decision, I knew, was only the beginning of the storm that was about to hit my family, and the fallout arrived faster than I could have imagined. The aftermath hit harder than I expected. I had barely made it home when I felt the shift, an uneasy stillness in the air, the kind that tells you a storm has already broken somewhere else. I later learned that Caitlin collapsed into tears the moment she walked through her front door, and by evening the shock had spread through their whole family. Evan called me sounding shaken, torn between love for his wife and fear of what her parents were telling him. Hearing the strain in his voice was its own kind of heartbreak. The next day, the real blow arrived. Her father, a man who had always carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, began sending threats through an attorney, accusations of retaliation, of personal vendettas, of unprofessional conduct, claims so exaggerated they almost felt surreal. But there was nothing surreal about the tightening in my chest as I read them. Being attacked for doing the right thing stirred something old inside me, a memory of all the times I had stayed quiet to avoid conflict. This time, I didn't shrink. Instead, I gathered every document, every report, every audit showing exactly why the decision had been necessary. I spoke with my own counsel, steady and composed, reminding myself that truth doesn't need theatrics, it only needs clarity. By the end of the week, the fear that had hovered around me began to dissolve. In its place came a grounded resolve. I wasn't just protecting a company. I was standing up for myself in a way I never had before. And that strength carried me straight into the moment where everything finally settled into place. When the dust finally settled, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The truth held firm, and the people who mattered could finally see the situation for what it was. Evan admitted he had been swept up in the pressure of someone else's expectations, and our relationship slowly found its footing again. Nothing healed overnight, but the ground between us stopped shaking. What surprised me most was how steady I felt. Standing up for myself hadn't made me harder, it made me clearer. I learned that boundaries aren't walls, they're quiet lines of self-respect, and once I drew mine, everything around me shifted into place. Harbor Point began stabilizing, and so did I. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't surviving. I was choosing deliberately, confidently, fully aware of my own worth. And that clarity carried me into the final chapter of this journey, where everything I learned finally came together. Thank you for listening to my story. Walking through all of this reminded me that strength doesn't always come from grand gestures. It often grows quietly, in the moments when we choose ourselves, even when it's hard. I'm grateful for the lessons, the healing, and the clarity that followed. If my journey taught me anything, it's that resilience lives in all of us, waiting for its chance to surface. If any part of this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a moment that forced you to reclaim your own worth? Share your story in the comments. I read every one.